Contains depictions of violence and animal cruelty. Viewer discretion advised. At dawn, the stone drank in the sun like a slow, waking thing. The columns of the mortuary temple threw long, blue shadows across paved courts. Incense still smoked from the last night's offerings and mixed with the dry breath of the desert. Behind a sealed doorway, beyond a narrow corridor whose walls were scored with ritual texts and the names of kings, there were rooms the public never saw. Treasuries lined with gold stored under linen. Inner sanctuaries where the king performed rites that bound his person to the land. Chambers shut so tightly that air itself seemed to fold over the threshold. It is here, in the cool dark beneath carved beams, that power took shape as appetite. Appetite for immortality, for spectacle, for dominion. These forbidden rooms were not merely private spaces, they were instruments. They condensed the pharaoh's claims into objects, rituals, and visible mystery. They taught a people what the king might touch and what the king might not allow them to see. Subscribe and hit the bell to stay for the full examination of pharaonic secrecy. Historians and travelers from later ages, most famously Herodotus, wrote of the magnificence and the oddities of Egyptian kingship. Archaeologists, working from papyri, inscriptions, and the silent geometry of tombs, have given us the architecture back. Between those sources, a pattern emerges. Where the pharaoh's outer face was public and ornate, the inner life of the palace and temple was deliberately opaque. The sealed rooms, the painted doors, and the sacral boxes held the mechanisms by which reverence was manufactured. To enter them, or to know their contents, was to gain insight into how a state made obedience look like worship. The origins of those closed spaces are ancient and functional. In the early cemeteries, the tomb's mastaba and the simple offering chapel protected cult goods and the statue that housed a dead man's ka. Over time, as kingship centralized, the forbidden moved from burial mounds to palace chambers and temple sanctuaries. The necropolis gave way to the mortuary temple. Offerings on a table became staged processions and public festivals. What began as a provision for the dead became a theater for living power. The Sed festival, the Opet procession, the coronation rites, each depended on an inner sanctum, where the king exchanged tokens with gods, where names were inscribed and renewed. These were not purely private religious acts. They were rehearsals of authority. Consider the spaces themselves. There are the hypostyle halls, meant for the many, their columns painted with lotus and papyrus designs. Beyond them are vestibules where only select officials passed. A thin antechamber might lead to a serdab, the sealed room for a statue of the departed king, or to the holiest of holies, the naos, where the god's image resided. Builders closed doors with pins. Later hands bound seals with cord and resin. The archaeology shows intentionality, doorways blocked by masonry, storerooms packed not in haste but with ritual care. These were functional barricades and symbolic closures. They taught congregations where the boundary between the sacred and the profane lay. Inside the bound spaces were objects that spoke as loudly as law. Caches of stelae and votive offerings, chests of fine linen and garlands, alabaster jars that once held pure oils, crowns inset with faience and precious stones. In one storeroom, later unsealed by archaeologists, a pallet lay among ritual knives, a remnant of daily grooming ritual elevated to sacred performance. That pallet testified to a central truth. The king's body was itself a site of spectacle. To anoint the pharaoh was to perform his right to speak for the land. To apparel him in regalia was to render his person comprehensible to a people who had to be taught again and again to recognize authority. We must be precise when we attribute motive. The private rooms did not exist because pharaohs were merely ostentatious. They arose from a politics of scarcity and mediation. The priesthood managed grain, land, and ritual. The palace controlled water, military force, and tribute. The secret sanctuaries concentrated religious capital into the hands of a few and converted that capital into administrative control. When a pharaoh received offerings in a closed chamber, the distribution of those offerings, who ate, who received rations, who did not, reinforced hierarchies. Ritual and economy braided together around thresholds that the majority could not cross. There were, too, displays intended for the public eye that derived their power from private preparation. The Apet festival began in the inner rooms with rites that recharged the images of gods. Barges were laden in hidden quays, their timbers cut and fastened in secret shipyards. The public procession, priests, boat-borne images, a king appearing itinerary-like from doorways, depended upon backstage work. The refinement of apparel, the insertion of sacred names on statues, the maintenance of masks that would never be seen beyond the avenue. In that sense, the forbidden rooms were laboratories of spectacle. The state curated appearances so carefully that belief could be induced rather than assumed. Pharaohs varied, as did their uses of secrecy. Hatshepsut paraded divine lineage through reliefs at Deir el-Bahri, while she preserved ritual core spaces for the priests who blessed her rule. Akhenaten built a new city and reconfigured temples, demanding that some rooms be opened and others closed to control worship. His revolution reveals how access to sacred space could be the very technology of reform. Ramses II, who perpetuated his image across massive facades and in battle reliefs, maintained inner treasuries and sanctuaries from which he issued priestly approvals. The great kings understood a simple arithmetic. Visibility multiplied authority, but it had to rest upon inviolate secrecy. Not all of the power wrought in forbidden rooms was symbolic. They could also contain coercion. Captive kings, foreigners, and insurrectionists were sometimes paraded before the populace, their names chiseled into victory scenes, while the real degrading work, the binding, the accounting of prisoners, the decisions over life and death, took place behind doors. Inscriptions from temples and victory stelae show captives bound and presented. Elsewhere, administrative papyri record the procurement and movement of laborers and the allocation of detainees. These records are not dramatic narratives, they are bureaucratic traces, but traces matter. They show how spectacle and subjugation were intertwined. The image of the subject, displayed in triumph, began in rooms where that subject had been rendered helpless and processed. The forbidden rooms also held a softer, more intimate authority, the politics of marriage, concubinage, and the palace household. The word harem summons modern fantasies. The reality was a complex institution in which women could be simultaneously protected, controlled, and influential. Their quarters, often entirely separate, were part of the palace's closed world. Some royal women used seclusion to consolidate power. Hatshepsut, again, is illustrative, ruling with masculine iconography, yet relying on inner sanctuaries where ritual legitimacy was transmitted. That inner domesticity, the distribution of gifts, the ceremonial mother's roles, the genealogy kept in quiet rooms, was as much a resource as the treasury. The commodification of animals also found its way into forbidden stores. Exotic beasts arrived from distant provinces as tribute. The official records, and the occasional boast in a stela, note elephants, lions, and various birds moved into royal menageries. Artistic programs display vanquished beasts as trophies. Archaeological faunal assemblages suggest intense pressure on some species near centers of power. Scholars caution against pronouncing extinctions, but decline and local depletion are plausible. When a prized animal was presented within a palace court, its image reinforced the king's reach. When that animal was kept within inner yards or chained in rear rooms, it became a living emblem of dominion, a trophy and a threat. If the treasury and the sanctuary were instruments of governance, so too were the architects and technicians who made them. Quarrymasters, stonecutters, carpenters, and the priestly scribes who recorded inventories were the hidden workforce. Excavations at Giza and Deir el-Medina reveal that those work gangs lived in organized villages, fed and managed by the state. Their letters, grave markers, and the archaeology of their settlements show dignity and hardship. They received rations and were expected to keep secrets. Their loyalties were to the system. Their skills enabled the pharaoh's mysteries. Yet their lives also make visible a moral complication. The monuments of secrecy were built by hands that later buckled under the weight of obligations imposed upon them. We can imagine a corridor conversation, a plausible reconstruction held to the evidence by its restraint. A foreman, dust in his beard, consults with a scribe as they tally bronze fittings in a storeroom. The king's chest is sealed for the festival, the scribe says. Only the second priest may open it. The foreman nods. Then we must place the cedar boards tonight and set the lintel. The men will expect their bread. Short exchanges like that, drawn from the textures of administrative papyri and the conditions revealed by worker settlements, give us the human scale behind institutional secrecy. They remind us that behind every closed door were rituals of labor and logistics, small human bargains that sustained grandeur. The moral, no less complicated, persists in the methods of control. In temples and palaces, inscriptions and carved images taught a vision of the world in which the king was mediator between cosmic order and human disorder. To violate that order was to invite chaos. To witness the ceremonial affirmation of order was to be soothed into submission. The forbidden room was a pedagogical device. By keeping certain rites hidden, the state dramatized the distance between ruler and ruled. Darkness made the ritual seem more absolute. The very fact that the populace did not know what occurred behind the sealed doors made the rituals more effectual. Not everyone accepted the logic of sacral secrecy. Greek visitors and later Roman observers sometimes found the opaque Egyptian rites bewildering or suspect. Herodotus suggested that some ceremonies were staged to astonish. His tone, filtered through Greek expectations, implies skepticism. Within Egyptian society, the sources are more muted. Nevertheless, dissent existed in the margins. Anonymous scribes, the quiet sarcasm of satirical tales, and, centuries later, theological critiques by monotheists who found the vast aggregation of images and rites objectionable. These dissenting notes, when they appear, remind us that secrecy did not produce unanimity, but a fragile consensus propped by ritual competence and administrative reach. The social costs of the forbidden rooms were not only moral, but material. The resources poured into sanctuaries and private chambers, fine woods, imported incense, metalwork, were substantial. The Nile economy could sustain large-scale projects for long periods. Yet the allocation of labor and tribute entailed choices. Where did the grain go, the timber, the laborers? The inscriptions do not always answer, but the distribution is visible in the archaeological record. The scale of obelisks quarried and transported, the fleets constructed to move cult images, the logistics of dressmaking and jewelry that kept regalia ever new. Every item locked away in a royal vault represented a tax on the commons. There is tragedy in this enclosure. Temples became storehouses of wealth that could not easily serve the needs of sick or hungry people except according to the king's priorities. When famine struck or foreign incursion disrupted harvests, the sanctity of the inner chambers often made them untouchable. In such moments, the line between piety and negligence thins. Later sources record petitions to the throne and appeals to the priesthood. Papyri preserve pleas for remission. The social contract, when strained, shows its fraying threads. And there is the human cost in a more direct sense. The list of those who served the Pharaoh's mysteries, conscripted builders, bonded craft workers, captives pressed into service, is long. Some inscriptions celebrate labor as honor. Others, in letters and graffiti, show weariness. The imagery of captives carved into triumphant walls was mirrored by practical policies that used the captured to perform tasks associated with palace secrecy, the movement of goods, the guarding of storerooms, the execution of rituals under the supervision of priests. The spectacle of triumph in public reliefs masked the small, steady coercions behind closed doors. The forbidden rooms also contained a darker theater, the staging of mortality. Royal mortuary rituals rehearsed the king's death even as they sought to elude it. The death mask, the funerary boat, the mummified remains, these were instruments designed to bind a name across generations. But keeping death out required extraordinary investment. Tombs were stocked with food and goods for an imagined afterlife. Storerooms held models and offerings to be used in perpetuity. In that sense, the chambers were repositories of denial of the ordinary end to power, an attempt to freeze a person in a perpetual sequence of ritual performances. Yet power proved porous. Grave robbers breached vaults designed by the most ingenious architects. In later centuries, the rooms that had been closed for ritual became cupboards for thieves. The ruin of secrecy came not suddenly, but as a process: economic shift, religious change, military conquest. When an alien ruler or a new religion altered the cultural calculus, the sanctuaries lost their force. Christian polemicists later found empty shrines and repurposed stones. Temples were stripped and obelisks sawn and transported. The once forbidden doors, sealed with ritual care, were forced open by time and greed. The climax of this moral architecture is felt in silence. Walk a deserted avenue of sphinxes as dusk gathers, and you will hear echoes where once a procession roared. The carved names fade. The paint that once signified divine colors flakes away. The rooms lie open to dust. That decline is not merely physical. It invites a reflection. A people taught reverence by design found themselves, centuries later, in a landscape of ruins whose authority had receded. The forbidden rooms, stripped and looted, still bear witness. Their emptiness is a lesson inscribed in stone. To stand within a former sanctum today is to confront the afterlife of power. The cool air of a sealed chamber now open to sunlight reveals chisel marks and measure lines. The bowls that once held oils are cracked but present. The seal impressions on clay tags tell inventories and names. List after list of cedar planks, linen rolls, oil jars, a ledger of what mattered to those who managed the king's ritual life. These technical remnants are moral maps. They show where care accumulated, where resources concentrated, and where choices were made that favored spectacle over subsistence. There is a final human image that returns us to the title's promise. The darkest desires of the rulers were not always in the form of gold or exotic beasts, but in the demand for ritual testimony. A pharaoh did not simply crave possession, he craved recognition that his person had been enacted into the cosmos. The private rooms were proofs of that enactment, the evidence that the king could be repeated in offerings and names long after his body failed. That desire, institutionalized and protected by walls, produced both art of incomparable sophistication and forms of social coercion that extracted life and labor to keep the ritual machinery humming. What, then, should the modern viewer take from the echoing chambers? First, that secrecy is a technology of power. Second, that monumental beauty can coexist with ethical deprivation. Third, that the ruins are not passive romantic relics, but active prompts to remember how wealth concentrates, how spectacle masks labor, how sanctity can become a pretext for exclusion. If this account arouses indignation, note that indignation is not the only response history asks of us. Careful reflection, the study of lines incised by a mason's tool, the translation of a tax roll, the attentive reading of what is present and what is missing, yields a sober understanding of systems. In that work lies the possibility of discernment, recognizing when a public show functions to legitimize injustices and asking who pays the cost. If these rooms teach a last lesson, it is this: a closed door can be both shelter and cell. When we stand among the fallen lintels and the empty sanctuaries, we are made to choose, to marvel and forget, or to marvel and remember the hands that built what we admire. The ruins call us not to simple condemnation, but to a complex care, to measure the beauty of an object against the human account of its making and maintenance. If this investigation spoke to you, subscribe, like, and tell us in the comments which forbidden room of ancient power struck you most. We will explore a related site in our next episode. But not all closures were absolute seals against time. More often, they were thresholds where the intentional gave way to the accidental. In Anatolia, a palace storeroom, once hermetically sealed against impurity, became, centuries later, a midden where domestic pottery accumulated. The very lintel that had barred sacrilege now bore a graffiti scrawled by a child who had no use for cultic propriety. In the highlands of the Andes, a shrine roofed in cedar and painted with ancestor faces was later cut open and its beams reused in a commoner's hut. These reversals, sacred to profane, secret to utilitarian, are themselves a kind of archaeology of meaning. They show how the techniques of exclusion eventually surrender to everyday economy, to the persistent friction of use. Archaeologists learn to read that friction. They do not only follow great inscriptions and gold, they follow the patterns of absence. A pad of earth where no hearth ash lies, a shelf too shallow to have held a lamp, a niche whose plaster lacks soot. Those are the negative traces of ritual cleanliness. Equally eloquent are the traces that betray intrusion, scraping marks on a sealed doorway, a modern nail driven through an ancient beam, later bones mixed with earlier deposits. By attending to what is missing, scholars can reconstruct the intentional choreography that once made a room forbidden. The pale ledger of a clay archive may not say, "Do not enter," but it lists offerings, rations, the names of workers paid to stand watch. From such lists, the outlines of prohibition emerge. Consider, for example, the inventories found in a cache beneath a temple floor. Columns of cuneiform that enumerate oil jars, rolls of linen, chests of cedar. One line reads like dry bookkeeping, "To the sanctuary, 40 measures of oil." Another reads like a social ledger, names of men and the burdens assigned to them. Together, they map the labor behind a closed door. Who chopped the wood? Who wove the linens? Who tended the lamps? The ritual show is not a magic trick conjured out of nothing. It is a dense network of procurement and coercion, of people whose labor rarely appears on the stone monuments. Those lists are, in a sense, the counter-testimony of the shut room, proof that secrecy demanded support. There is also the matter of scale. Small forbidden rooms, private shrines, family mortuary chapels can concentrate intimacy into architecture. A chamber barely 6 paces across, once lined with painted plaster and the names of ancestors, can yield more about household piety than a grand temple. Its ceramics will show where the children spilled their food. A broken spindle may indicate women's work. A child's toy left among the offerings will alter our sense of who belonged inside and who was excluded. Conversely, imperial sanctuaries concentrate wealth and spectacle. Their sealed doors are stages for state ideology. Both kinds of secrecy, domestic and imperial, are instructive because they fold different degrees of power into similar mechanisms: boundary, performance, ledger. One recurring surprise in fieldwork is how often the unauthorized voice persists within the forbidden architecture. Scratchings along a doorway recount names in a hurried hand. Casual prayers erased by time, curses hurled by those denied access. A pig-greased thumbprint can connect a nameless laborer to the veneer of sanctity. In Pompeian houses, ashlar walls that once presented an image of patrician order hold, behind the frescoes, soot-blackened servant quarters. In Egyptian occult chambers, the graffiti of later priests reveal disputes about competence and inheritance of ritual formulas. These pettier marks, the marginalia of empire, remind us that power was contested at the margins as much as it was asserted on the center stage. The tools of modern inquiry are modest and precise. Stratigraphy teases apart sequences of use. Microbotanical analysis reveals oils and resins applied in rites. Residue on ceramic rims names substances once thought invisible. Even in cases where collectors removed objects with a haste that destroyed context, careful comparison of material styles and the sketches of early travelers can allow scholars to reassemble cohorts of things that once belonged together. The aim is not merely to recover treasure, but to recapture practice, how an object was set, how hands handled it, which senses it summoned. The ordinary detail, flake of paint, worn tongue of a wooden ladle, the brittle thread of a linen cuff, is the clue that re-inhabits a closed room. There are instances where the reopening of a forbidden door caused contemporary moral controversies. When a subterranean chamber under a royal tomb was breached in the modern era, newspapers framed the act as either scientific reclamation or sacrilege. Descendant communities sometimes see the exploration of such rooms as a second violation, another theft layered upon an original one. These debates disclose a central paradox. Secrecy can protect, but secrecy can also silence. What had once been closed to maintain social order may now, when opened by outsiders, become a source of painful revelation. Listening to those modern voices is part of responsible stewardship. The archaeologist's right to knowledge must often be negotiated with the living memories of those who claim the site. That negotiation frequently turns on questions of provenance and position. Museums and private collections hold objects that were removed from forbidden rooms in moments of colonial expansion. The case of a carved door panel shipped across the sea and reinstalled in a gallery offers a typical scenario. Displayed as aesthetic triumph, it is stripped of the ledger and the names that gave it meaning. Scholars now emphasize contextual display, showing fragments of the original structure, providing facsimiles of the surrounding inscriptions, and admitting the object's messy biography, how it was ritually shut, how it was pried open, how it crossed borders. To treat such objects as mere art is to flatten their history. To present their provenance fully is to reintroduce the hands and the labor that made and maintained the secrecy. There is, too, a pedagogical function in studying forbidden rooms. For the modern public, these spaces complicate simple narratives about antiquity. They resist the sentimental idea that ancient peoples lived in transparent, communal harmony. They complicate the heroic notion that monuments were purposively public goods for all. Instead, the evidence teaches that social privilege has long been insulated by architecture and ritual. Recognizing this invites a sober humility. The same human designs that produced beauty also produced exclusion. That is not a condemnation that leads to nihilism. It is a foundation for critique and for reimagining how we honor the past. Yet not every closed door was imposed from above. Some communities deliberately sealed rooms to preserve memory. Houses where epidemics have taken place were sometimes closed as a form of protection, against contagion and against forgetting. In a small village, a cellar may be shut after a sudden death, not as a statement of power, but as an act of mourning. The closed door here is a refuge for grief. Distinguishing between such closures requires sensitivity to scale, to context, to the distribution of resources. A royal chamber sealed with a state archive is different in intent from a household sealing a trunk. Both deserve study. Both teach different facets of how people relate to absence. The aesthetic consequences of long secrecy are also instructive. Paintings preserved in darkness develop a patina distinct from those exposed to daylight. Pigments retain a depth that later renovations can rarely reproduce. In some sanctuaries, the very effort to keep things hidden resulted in better preservation. Offerings left untouched for centuries constellated into a time capsule. The irony is that an act intended to prevent change sometimes produces the best evidence for the past. Archaeologists thus owe a debt to the purveyors of closure. Their taboos, however coercive, have sometimes protected the material record we rely on today. The ethics of studying and displaying those finds remain contested. Should a community request reburial of objects that were once their sacred property? Should museums repatriate items acquired under dubious circumstances? The answers are not purely legal, but moral. Practically, many institutions now engage in collaborative curatorship. Exhibitions co-created with descendant groups, educational programs that foreground local narratives, and digital repatriation, high-resolution scans that allow communities access to images of objects even when the originals remain elsewhere. Such practices acknowledge that the history of a sealed room does not end when its physical barrier is breached. The story continues in the political and ethical relationships that follow. Finally, perhaps the most human residue of all is the voice that clandestine chambers keep alive. In one vaulted room, beneath a collapsed roof, conservators found a strip of papyrus smeared with a mother's prayer for a child. The text had been tucked among tax receipts and ritual prescriptions, almost lost among the bureaucratic. Its presence reorients our attention to the private pleadings and the small hopes lodged within systems of power. Those marginal voices are the real counter-testimony to the spectacle. They insist that secrecy never belonged wholly to the sovereign, It was also home to the fearful, the hopeful, and the grieving. So when we stand before a closed lintel, or an emptied shrine, or a ledger of names, the question we inherit is not only historical, but ethical. What do we do with what we learn? Do we celebrate the monument without attending to its costs? Do we let the ruin remain an object of aestheticized nostalgia? Or do we take the archive of absence as a summons to account? To remember the labor, to listen for the marginalized scrawls, to recover the human ledger from beneath the official one. The rooms themselves cannot answer. They only hold the light long enough for us to see where power gathered and who kept watch while it did. A conservator at dusk, in a makeshift tent among potsherds and catalog cards, traces with a fine brush the edge of a painted name. The stroke is faint, nearly lost to abrasion. Yet as the damp brush lifts the layer of dirt, the letters brighten. It is not the name of a king carved in triumphal boldness. It is the name of a woman, brief, ordinary, stubbornly present. For a moment, the sealed room seems to breathe toward her. That small revelation, the discovery of an otherwise anonymous presence, reframes the entire architecture of exclusion. The forbidden room, for all its pomp and protocol, had contained also the particular human life that made the ritual meaningful. And that is perhaps the last lesson these emptied sanctuaries offer, that behind every design of power there are names worth recovering. She bent closer to the painted letters until the lamp at her elbow pooled into a private sun. The brush in her hand trembled as if it were remembering the weight of an older hand. Not the steady stroke of a scribe in an archive, but the quick, economized gesture of someone who marked a vessel to claim it, to keep track of what mattered in a household that could barely keep count. The woman's name was brief, 3 signs, ordinary as any common name, and yet the smallness of it struck like an accusation. How many records in that catalog had been allowed the dignity of full phrases and titles, while this single mark had to struggle for air beneath soot and the indifferent rubbing of time? Outside the tent, the camp had gone quiet. The digging was done for the day, and most of the team had crawled into their canvas shelters. Only a few inconspicuous lights dotted the field. Headlamps left on timers so that a guard might check the trenches without waking all who slept. The conservator listened to the nocturnal noises of a site cooling down. The distant cough of a truck, the intermittent bark of a dog, the wind moving like a slow hand over the uncovered soil. Inside, under the canvas, the ritual of unmasking continued in reverent slowness. She set down the brush and reached for a scrap of paper where she had been making notes, jottings that would later be codified into records with rigid reference numbers and cross-checks. The woman's name lay there, half-formed in the shorthand of the field, a transliteration, a few phonetic guesses, a parenthetical note about erosion. The conservator's training told her to be cautious. Names could be misread, signs confused with others, the dirt itself an accomplice in misdirection. But the brush had already decided for her. In the gentle, accidental way of small discoveries, it had restored a curve of ink that the naked eye would have missed. She folded the slip of paper and slipped it into her pocket. There are some acts of scholarship that require distance, others require proximity. This felt, impossibly, like an act of companionship. She imagined the woman, hands nimble with domestic work, perhaps a fragment of conversation lodged in a corner of the sealed room, a child's laughter that did not make it into any ledger. There was no way to know her story in full, but naming is a kind of retrieval. Even the smallest sound, rendered aloud, reoriented the architecture around that absence. In the weeks that followed, the slow mechanics of post-excavation took over. The conservator wrote formal reports. The site director scheduled meetings with the local municipality and with representatives of nearby villages. The objects were photographed, measured, assigned accession numbers. The sealed room, its lintel now open, its contents catalogued, became for a moment the center of a small gravity well that pulled in journalists, students, and scholars with hungry but varied aims. Some sought headlines. Some sought technical data. Some, quietly, sought absolution for earlier errors. Museum pieces acquired a century ago under circumstances now judged morally dubious. It was in one of those meetings, convened in a municipal office that smelled of coffee and official paper, that the question of restitution was put plainly. A delegate from a nearby community leaned forward and said, "We do not want everything. We want the right things to be right." He asked not only for objects, but for context. Who kept the room sealed? To what end? And whose hands had performed the rituals that bound those goods to memory? His tone was not accusatory, it was exacting. The sealed room had not only preserved material culture, it had frozen the decisions of governance, kinship, and ritual practice. Undoing what had been done required more than legal paperwork. It demanded procedures of listening. The conservator proposed an exhibition that would not go on until the local communities felt prepared to participate. She argued for display cases that would not only show the artifacts, but would also tell the stories they could not speak for themselves. Maps of origin, testimonies of elders, and the careful reproduction of the sealed room's plan so visitors could understand context rather than fetishize objects. She wanted the woman's name, now spelled with greater confidence in the catalog, to be placed near the modest items that had surrounded it. A coarse comb, a small copper pin, a broken bowl with traces of a vegetable stew long turned to stain. These were not treasures of empire, they were domestic things that anchored a life. Negotiations were slow. Curators and legal counsel debated provenance. Funders calculated budgets. Activists argued for immediacy, while anthropologists advised patience. At moments, the work felt bureaucratic in the worst sense. Forms and signatures and committees. Yet the conservator kept returning to the tiny, restoring motion she had made in the tent. If the field is ever to be ethical, she thought, it must find ways to transpose that small, intimate attention into institutions that are often deaf to quiet claims. So the plan that finally emerged was deliberate in 3 parts. First, a period of community consultation. Local elders, craftspeople, and descendants of families from the valley would be invited to view the objects, to speak about them, and to make requests. Second, a traveling exhibit would be designed together with those communities. Displays that could be brought to village halls and to the National Museum so the narrative would... Third, a program of digital access would be established. High-resolution images, translations of labels, and oral histories recorded in the languages people still spoke at kitchen tables. Importantly, the digital strategy was framed not as an alternative to restitution, but as a complement. Images and metadata could travel while objects sometimes could not. The implicit promise was that access could be widened even as material control was negotiated. When the conservator returned to the field months later, the sealed lintel was no longer the scene of a sudden unmooring, but of a carefully staged revelation. Local embroiderers had been shown the patterns on some cloth fragments and had produced new panels that echoed them, not to replace the originals, but to make the motifs legible to outsiders. A young scholar from the nearest university had written an accessible piece on household economies and delivered it in the local dialect at a community center. Those who attended spoke openly about their memories of similar items, adding the kind of oral richness that archives usually lack. The conservator arranged the items on padded supports beneath filtered light. Beside each object, she placed a card that, for once, did not read first with a museum accession number, but with a name. Belongs to households of the Eastern Ridge. Evidence suggests household use. Decorative pin, likely personal. Bearing inscription, name, reconstructed. The woman's name, now printed with the care of a typesetter, seemed to give the objects a new gravity. Visitors paused longest at that cluster. An old woman, eyes bright as glass, ran a fingertip over the glass as if she could trace the ripple of a remembrance. "My grandmother used one like that," she said. "We called that stitch for the bread. We used to put names on jars so no one would take them." Conversations proliferated. A schoolteacher proposed that the story of the sealed room be taught as part of a local curriculum, not as a trophy of scientific conquest, but as an example of why documentation, memory, and ethical practice should go hand in hand. A young activist suggested that museums create formal pathways for objects with contested origins to be reviewed periodically, allowing communities to petition for transfer. None of these solutions erased the past. They only made a space in which the past could be addressed with a measure of humility. At the formal opening of the traveling exhibit, the conservator stood at the back, hands folded, listening as speakers took turns. There were apologies shaped like confessions, some halting, some carefully composed, and there were gratitude speeches so artless that they glowed. A representative of a national museum announced a joint stewardship agreement. Certain items would remain in public care, but their display and interpretation would henceforth be shared. In the press photographs, the conservator could later see herself small among flags and faces. She was content with that anonymity. Her work, she had learned, was not to possess, but to produce the conditions under which others might reclaim. After the opening, as the crowd thinned into conversations, an elder approached her. He had been one of the delegates in those early municipal meetings, and he carried with him an unpretentious dignity. "You found her name," he said, and the sentence was more a report than a question. The conservator nodded. He took a breath and told her something she had not expected, that names in his community were often the first step toward ritual recognition. To say a name with intent could summon reparative gestures, cooking a meal in honor, naming a child, speaking the name aloud in gatherings. It was not merely commemoration, it was an act that reshaped social memory. In time, at a small gathering beneath an olive tree in the village, the conservator heard the woman's name spoken again, this time with prayers and with recipes and with laughter. A simple clay bowl, a careful modern replica made by a local potter after the original, was placed on a low table. Someone told a story about a neighbor who used to mend a hem with the same kind of stitch, and a child asked what it would be to live in a house so full of simple things. For the first time since the lintel was opened, the sealed room's contents had taken a life within the community from which they had been severed. There were still disputes, legal maneuvers and debates about who had the authority to decide, but those were public and ordinary in their messiness. The larger change had been in orientation. Museums, archaeologists, and communities had acknowledged what the sealed rooms themselves had implied all along. An archive is not merely a repository of objects, it is a constellation of human claims. Opening a lintel does not conclude the matter. It starts a conversation whose terms are moral as much as technical. Late one afternoon, some months after the exhibit had begun its itinerary, the conservator returned to the site where she had first brushed the letters clean. The ground where the tent had stood was resown with grass. Wind had scattered the paper slips she had once used. She knelt by the lintel and traced with her finger the weathered stone that had once sealed a world away. The namelessness that had once hung heavy there had been reduced, at least in part, to a sound. She read the name aloud, not into a tent now, but into the field itself, as if the soil might carry the syllables home. Saying it broke nothing and mended nothing. It simply lodged the woman more fully in the world of the living. There are no final answers to the questions a sealed room poses, only practices by which we attempt to make those answers less unjust. The conservator rose, dusted her hands, and walked away with the faint relief of one who has returned a single voice to the chorus. The lintel remained a place where light came and went, but it no longer held only the weight of deliberate exclusion. It held, too, the small, stubborn traces of a life that would not be entirely forgotten.